questions occur to you as I'm discussing with you, hopefully exploring together with you, so you can also see what is the essence of psychopathology, and from that, how does our understanding of the essence of psychotherapy flow. In that position, we assume that psychotherapy is not just a technique. A technique we can perform irrespective of our understanding of pathology, because the technique tells us precisely what to do, irrespective of the particular presenting problem. Just do the thing. What we need to understand, first of all, is the essence of pathology. And how it arises, and how psychotherapy is designed to deal with that essence of pathology. Okay. If I share with you, well, let me ask you first of all, do you have any hunch as to what the essence of pathology is all about? When does pathology really begin? Psychologically. Feel free, hunches.
Well, it's expected it begins early in life.
When what happens psychologically? It may begin early, it may begin later. Maybe for some it doesn't begin. But what has to happen psychologically for pathology to exist? What do we mean by a pathological state? Anybody have any idea?
Can you view it as some sort of arrested development from the normal development?
All right, that's one way we can consider it. That is a process of how it occurs. Some may want to consider pathology a state of psychological fixation, or an arresting of the psychological maturation process, so that somehow we do not continue to grow or mature beyond a psychological child or adolescent level. We don't move into psychological adulthood, whatever that may be. We haven't discussed that yet. So one way of considering psychopathology is by considering an arresting condition, a fixating condition, so that we cease to mature psychologically and we remain fixed upon a particular identification with something out of our childhood, such as feelings of insecurity, worthlessness, inadequacy, weakness, helplessness, vulnerability. We have all felt those feelings in childhood. And for some reason or other, something happens psychologically that makes us continue to remain psychologically identified with those feelings at a particular level, usually below conscious awareness, preconscious or subconscious. That's only one element of pathology, and we're going to understand that. So we're asking, how does psychopathology begin?
Doesn't it have to do with the objectification of at a certain level of experience you're outside of yourself?
Okay, let's explore that then. Thoughtful response. Usually we start with a sense of threat, which we call anxiety, or psychological fear. And that threat is to a experience of psychological pain, the essence of which we haven't discussed yet. The threat is of pain, some kind of psychological pain. When we talk about the beginning of pathology, we're talking about threat and pain, but this is not yet pathology. Pathology will begin when there is a disconnecting or a disowning or a rejecting of the conscious awareness of this threat to pain of a particular nature we haven't discussed yet. What do we mean by threat and pain? So that if threat and pain is acceptable to my conscious awareness, and I'm in a state of unification with it in conscious awareness, I may be uncomfortable, but there's not yet a state of psychopathology. I'll just throw this out early so that you'll have a basis for consideration, and I'll get into much more depth. that psychopathology begins when I disown those feelings of anxiety and pain, when I feel psychologically unrelated to them, when I pretend somehow that I myself have not authored these feelings, and I'm able to let them go in such a way as to be able to release them from conscious awareness into preconscious or subconscious functioning, where they become fixated. So I'm going to discuss this in much more detail, but let me just say right off the bat, and then I'll get to it, that psychopathology begins when there's a state of self-division, in which there is a splitting between the subjective knowing part of my being and my experiential objects, the things that I know. Originally, I hold these feelings to be me. When pathology begins, I brand these feelings as being not self. I brand them as other. And I identify only with the conscious part of my being, so that if a feeling is conscious, what I do then is I contract away from that so that the feeling becomes lodged in what is darkness, because conscious awareness is light. And then what happens is that my own conscious awareness feels shrunken, feels contracted. I am less conscious than before. Now, again, I'll go into all these in much more depth. The reason I say this is to start out by helping you to recognize that if the essence of pathology is an internal splitting, a dualistic process in which I make two guides out of one, I'm saying in the sense that my conscious subjective sense of self feels like an entity that is divorced from its experiential objects. This is not me. I am power. I am not a feeling of weakness. I am security. I am not a feeling of insecurity. There is a psychological divorce from what was originally a unity condition. I was a oneness. I now split and disown my own experiential objects of knowledge, so that I don't know them anymore. I relegate them to a level where they are unknown to me, and I continue to believe that I am only what is up here in my conscious awareness, and I hold myself to be only this psychological entity that is conscious. What is preconscious, subconscious, and I don't want to jump the gun at this point. At the deeper level of our being, all of this remains unavailable to conscious awareness. And I hold myself to be only that which is non-threatening. Now, if we hold a state of subject-object duality, two-ness, to be the essence of pathology, and I must show you why that is as we go along. I'm just planting the seed right now. Then the essence of therapy has to be a state of subject-object non-duality. What's called a state of self-communion, a state of self-unification, self-integration, in which the original split within me into two becomes unified again, related again as one. So I acknowledge that these feelings are me, maybe not exclusively me, totally me, but these feelings are no longer not self. They are no longer other. They are me. And as a function of this state of subject-object non-duality, you will come to understand how the feelings become integrated back into consciousness, how they speak and drain out on their own, and how they are completely dissolved and transcended, outgrown, and we have matured beyond that level of immaturity. This is, of course, the focus of our discussions, how this takes place, under what circumstances it takes place, so you can begin to understand how most expeditiously to produce a therapeutic effect. It will explain what has previously been unexplained in the sense of the royal road to the repressed. I would also say to the suppressed, because we can become fixated at the preconscious level or the subconscious level. And I will explain that in a few minutes also. If this be the essence of pathology, and this be the essence of non-duality is the essence of therapy, then psychological health becomes truly a unity state. Unity of what? You'll find that it's not just within the mind that there's a unity, but throughout the totality of one's being in terms of every level of your awareness, there's a sense of unification rather than division, conflict, duality, two-ness. This feeling of pain, of worthlessness, whatever it may be. I don't own it. This is not me. I am only this feeling of worth up here. Now we have to understand, why do I do this? How does this take place? Can you begin to understand that threat or pain requires something first?
Defense.
Okay, defense employed by what? Whom? For there to be threat, must there not somehow be a psychological entity to be threatened? Must there not be a psychological entity that feels pain in a particular form of a sense of negation of itself? So we understand what the essence of threat or anxiety and pain really is. Anxiety represents a threat of a sense of negation of a sense of self, a psychological sense of self, without which, if I had no psychological sense of self, how could you threaten me? What would I be threatened by? You say, Hammer, you're worthless. So it's only a word. Maybe to you I am. Maybe to somebody else I'm relatively worthy. Where would be the psychological pain if not from a convicted feeling of the negation of the sense of self? This negation we call negative self-conceptualization, or feelings that represent the negation of my psychological sense of self. So, there's no way to understand the essence of pathology and therapy without understanding this psychological sense of self that does get threatened and that does feel pain. How else? How else can you presume anxiety? Threat. Can there be threat to no one? If I have no psychological sense of self, and here we're talking not self, but sense of self, because you will see that self creates sense of self, its concepts of itself, its ideas, its presumptions, its images of itself, and all the things upon which this sense of self is based, so that if any aspect of this sense of self is threatened, it is threatened with negation, nullification, extinction. It is like, because you are identified with it, that if it becomes disaffirmed and negated, you die psychologically. That's why it's so terribly threatening. So when we talk about psychological health, we're going to have to go beyond this entire concept of psychological sense of self, and therefore beyond psychological anxiety and psychological pain. So, when we talk about pain, we're talking about a certain level of tenuousness, fragility, shrunkenness of this psychological sense of self, where it feels itself to be fading into psychological nothingness. What else would be threatened in me? Say, Hammer, you're a lousy teacher. Well, to you I may be. It's a presumption on your part, a conceptualization, a value judgment. Somebody else might think I'm even worse, and somebody else might think I'm even better. But what am I really? They're all ideas. They're presumptions. What I am really, you'll find, is no idea. Because all ideas are relative. What is a good teacher? What is a good anything? It's all a relative concept. It's not absolute. We can't define the absolutely good teacher because it's relative to your own particular point of view. And if I please you, and if I'm consistent with your own theoretical point of view, it's a good teacher. If I'm inconsistent, it's a lousy teacher. If you have a bad day, you don't really understand what I'm saying because you're sleepy and tired. You'll say he's a lousy teacher because you don't accept the responsibility of not understanding. They'll say that I'm delivering poorly or whatever. And if you happen to learn something that really moves you very deeply and alters the way you function, you might say he's a grand teacher, but it's still the same individual. We don't know what it is to be a good teacher, a good anything, a good father, a good husband, a good sexual partner, a good anything. Okay? So I hope you can see that without a psychological entity, we cannot really explain anxiety or threat. If my identity is my physical entity, then we can explain fear, meaning the threat of the termination of my physical being in the same way as psychological fear or anxiety or threat represents the threat of the termination of my psychological entity-ness. I also feel it's important for you to understand, before I go any further, into what the psychological self is and what its components are, so you can begin to see when those components are, are threatened with nullification or negation, how the sense of self feels threatened and how defense arises against the experience of anxiety and the experience of pain. First of all, let me say that anxiety represents the threat of the nullification, and the psychological pain represents the actualization of that feeling of negation. Even if it isn't total negation, it's at least partially negated. So if my ego depends upon a sense of worth, and I feel that my worth is somewhat negated, then there is psychological pain in the form of the feeling of worthlessness. Or to take a moment to talk about the feeling of depression. It's not a feeling at all, but a label that we superimpose over some feeling of negation. So if I feel negated in my sense of worth and my sense of power, and I feel helpless or whatever, and we get into the ego, you see all of its components. You'll understand what I'm saying with that. And I find that what you have done makes me feel worthless. Then I might identify with this feeling of worthlessness and put all kind of hostility upon myself, and I repress the hostility as well, or I have hostility toward you, and I suppress that as well. And the worthlessness and the pain of the worthlessness and the pain of my hostility directed toward myself, all covered over by the label of depression, is experienced as this painful thing we call depression. Not realizing what the message is underneath that depression, not hearing the rage that we have toward ourselves and toward others, blocked and directed back upon ourselves. What we pretend is making us feel worthless and therefore psychologically extinguished, because if the ego is absolutely worthless, it ceases to exist at all, because to be something, you've got to be worthy in some way. To be totally valueless is to be nothing. You do not see yet how the ego equates those. So it isn't just worth or value or esteem, but a sense of continuation as a psychological sense of self that is being negated here and threatened. Now, not to jump the gun too fast, I hope that you will begin to see that psychological pain is something that is self-authored. Very important, because if you are the cause of my pain, say by rejecting me in a love relationship, if you are my parent or my partner, you reject me, if you're the cause of my pain and you die, then there's no way for me to undo the pain. Right? How will I? We have to see that we are the author of all of our painful feelings, and what a painful feeling is, I suppose though I even asked you at this point what a painful feeling is, what any feeling is. You might have difficulty telling me how a feeling is created. But we'll get into that also. Let me explore this with you so you can begin to see. You have rejected me, therefore I feel depressed. It seems like a one-to-one correspondence, but no. Please observe with me that it may not even be a rejection. Actually, you may be running from me because you're afraid I might reject you. It'll be too painful for you to deal with. But please understand that I take this fact, which is your leaving me, which is only a fact. There is no psychological pain, unless I conceptually abstract that fact and then react to my abstraction, which is the psychological sense of self equal ego, this psychological reaction. In other words, you reject me. interpret that to mean that you see no value in me, no worth in me. It confirms a sense of worthlessness, which I now identify myself with. I am now conceptualizing myself as worthless. You may not have intended any worthlessness at all. In fact, your rejection of me may be because I make you feel worthless. I may be, in your eyes, superior to you, intellectually, emotionally. You may be leaving me because you feel inferior. But look what I've done. I've taken this fact of rejection and I interpret it as a reflection of my lack of value, my lack of worth, my lack of esteem. Or I can take one of the other ego needs and show you that it may cause me pain because I interpret it as an abandonment. And I tell myself I react to that and tell myself I can't function when I'm abandoned. I need a parent figure to help me. Or I interpret it in terms of my conceptual identity as a male and say, aha, this rejection validates the fact that I'm not very much male, which I'm already harboring. Each of these I am already harboring. The worthlessness, the abandonment, the lack of masculinity, the feelings of total helplessness that some people try to make a whole theory of depression around. Because it's only one aspect of the ego, and therefore I can feel helpless in the fact that I can't really control you to love me, and that your rejection of me is an affirmation of my powerlessness, my helplessness to get you to stay with me, to love me, to affirm something valuable in me. And in that helplessness, there is a threat to the ego, which is identified with a sense of power or potency of willfulness, which we'll get into in 2 minutes.
Dr.
Yeah.
could I ask a question?
Sure.
So, is that to say that the person's pain is primarily self-authored? Let's say, for example, some child, 12, 13 years old, who might be in an abusive family and is physically abused, or
Yes.
whatever, and doesn't have the option just to leave the situation.
Yes.
Can something be done? Is that to say that that child is still self-authoring that pain?
Sure, but not the physical pain. I mean, there may be physical scars without psychological scars. And in some cases, that's true. Let's understand when it is true. But there may also be psychological scars, because if through the physical beating, I tell myself, this reflects the fact that I'm unlovable, and that I deserve this, and that I'm no good, and that I'm inferior because my parents loved only the females in the family, but not the males. This reflects my inferiority. If I respond to the physical abuse and create psychological scars the same way we're talking, if I hold myself responsible for this physical abuse, I will be psychologically disturbed. If I, for whatever reason, am mature enough to recognize that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't please them, and that they are really destructive people because I see them beating on each other and beating on the other kids, I don't take it so terribly personally. I'm sure I'm getting beaten, but I realize that I'm not being singled out, and therefore I can see my parents as being sick. It's his alcoholism. It's her alcoholism. It's her insecurity. It's her mental illness. She's been into the hospital 4 or 5 times. I don't blame myself then. She is the cause of my physical beating. So there may be physical scars, and I will grow up without the psychological scars if I can hold them to be truly responsible for my physical beating. But once I say, oh, I was not only physically beaten, sexually molested, sexually abused, and if I could hold my mother or my father responsible for this totally, there probably wouldn't be any psychological concomitants. But it's almost inevitable that I'm going to contribute something of my own to this, some element of real or unreal responsibility, some guilt because I enjoyed the experience at least a little bit, or felt hostile toward my parent, got my parent into trouble, I feel guilty because of that, or whatever else it may be. Something in my psychological reaction makes me hold on to something negative about myself that I have authored. I must be some kind of unlovable kid for my father to do this to me. I must be really stupid. I can't trust my own judgment. So I've trusted my father, and I needed love from him, and because I needed love from him, he took advantage of me. I hate my own neediness. I hate my own need for love. I hate my own misjudgment. I hate the fact that I can't trust my own reality, or whatever. Because if we're going to help individuals under any circumstances, you're going to have to move away from the situational reality that seems to be connected to and trigger the psychological state and our reaction to it. So even if you are my dearly beloved and you die, you see, I don't necessarily have to react to that. I probably will. I can react to it as it's sad, but I have to lose somebody I love and loves me. But I understand that death is a part of life. I don't hold myself responsible for not being the best partner in the world, being the best father, husband, son, daughter, child. So that your death makes me feel guilty because I could have been better to you. And, or I add on these other things to it. Your death means that I'm psychologically abandoned and I can't deal with that, so I react to the death. I feel worthless because you were the only source of my worth. I'm a desert and you are my oasis. Now that you're gone, I'm a desert again. You see, so it isn't the life circumstance. We mature psychologically as we begin to recognize that life is just doing its thing. There is death in it. There is loss in it. It's not surprising anybody. There's all these things in it, but in many cases we react to it in such a way as to reflect something negative about ourselves, which makes us feel more negated as a psychological sense of self. When we get to specific kinds of painful feelings, I will trace them step by step so you can see what's happening within the ego and why it feels threatened and why it responds the way it does and what this whole process of defense against anxiety and pain is really all about. Otherwise, you don't know how to begin with a patient. See? In fact, in many cases, the client won't even acknowledge that they're in pain. They want to change the environmental situation. I want to make my mother and father stop treating me this way, or my boyfriend or husband stop treating me this way. Yes, but madam, what's your reaction to the way he treats you? And they will fight this and resist this and not look at their own psychological authorship of threat and pain to this sense of self. The sense of self is part and parcel of psychological adolescence, this ego of ours. And when we become clearer about our real individuality and we're able to drop the ego and move into psychological adulthood, then people throwing names at us and words at us and are conceptualizing ourselves, because when we're in adolescence or early childhood, moving into our adolescence, we don't really know ourselves very well. Maybe I should take a moment to just explore this with you, see if you get to see that in childhood, I'm really an extension of my mother, for the most part, coming out of the womb. And I seek not to be a person in my own right, psychologically speaking, because separation is the same as abandonment and anxiety. I don't seek to psychologically move away from her. Attachment, being an extension of her, an extension of her personality, an extension of her will, an extension of her psychological being. And I'm secure in that, or I feel relatively secure in that. As I move into later childhood, I need to separate, psychologically speaking, from my mother, later on from my father and siblings and all the others as well. It's like I perpetuate a psychological womb after the physical womb, and there's an umbilical cord, a psychological umbilical cord that I'm going to have to learn to cut in order to become a psychological person in my own right. And some people never cut it, actually. And they're still like psychological children. I know you've seen them in psychotherapy. They're desperately hungry for attachment, for security, for dependency, clinging, almost in a suffocating manner in the way they attach themselves, parasitically almost, to somebody or to you, the therapist, and say basically, I feel insecure, I feel vulnerable, please take care of me, please take away my anxiety, help me, I can't help myself. So as we move away from our parents as an identity, we have no identity. We're not mature yet to know our real individual potentials and abilities, which we're going to actualize as we mature. Our real potentials, our real abilities, our real talents, our real functions. And so we have to create a psychological sense of self. Otherwise we can feel like a nothing. To feel like a nothing, we either have to reattach back to parents and become a reflection of them, a reflection of their values, a reflection of their personality, an emulation of them. So we get hostile when they get hostile, we go after alcohol when they go after alcohol, we handle stress in the same way they handle stress. We become pretty much a reflection of them. But in adolescence, we try to be our own person, but we're not mature enough to be consciously aware of our own particular talents and abilities. They usually come out in later adolescence, high school and college. You get to identify what you're naturally gifted at and what you enjoy doing that's particular to you. And you get to discover aspects of your real being, which have nothing to do with concepts and images in adulthood. But before that, you are required to have a sense of inner substantiality, psychologically speaking. So you invent one out of concepts and images and other things which we will discuss in a few moments. I want to explore that with you carefully so you can begin to see the truth of it. So I may remain fixated in childhood because there are feelings of insecurity and abandonment I have experienced. My mother wanted to get rid of me physically, or I felt she wanted to get rid of me psychologically. I felt threatened by siblings who were better than I was in so many ways. And so I had feelings of insecurity and inadequacy and powerlessness. My parents are very powerful. And I don't feel any sense of power to go out into the world and provide my own security, provide my own survival. Therefore, I remain clinging to them. I remain fixated upon these feelings of insecurity, vulnerability, helplessness, weakness, insecurity, and so forth and so on. All right, so let me get back to the original point, which is if you're going to understand anxiety, you're going to have to understand the ego and the components of it to know what component of the ego is being threatened. Because your therapy is going to center around what is painful to the client. The actualization of that threat becomes then pain. For example, if my sense of ego is identified with a sense of worth, and there's a threat to my sense of worth, even coming in therapy, I'm going to be nervous wreck just coming to therapy. I'm afraid you're going to see through me and see all this worthless garbage I've got in here. And so I'm trembling and my voice is shaking and I'm afraid just to come into therapy. Not because you're a bad guy or a bad gal, but because you have the capacity to wipe me out. You have the capacity to be psychological x-ray. You're going to look into me and see all the rage and all the ugliness and all the fear and all the manipulation I've done, all the terrible things that are there. I'm afraid of you. I'm afraid of the truth. And you're going to promote the truth in me. So I'm terribly afraid. And in many cases, the client comes not to grow or to mature psychologically, but to reinstitute what has been lost here. To reinstitute a sense of security lost by the loss of the original love object that provided that sense of security. They're looking for a replacement. Not to outgrow the child in themselves or the adolescent in themselves, but they are fixated at these levels and they seek a relationship with the therapist in such a way as to gratify, not outgrow, gratify needs from childhood. I want to feel gratified in my need for security. You must take care of me. You must make decisions for me. You must help me feel secure or worthy or adequate. So I tell you all these things I do, you're supposed to tell me how adequate I am. Or I relive the adolescent conflict with you, in which for me I'm taking on my father was an impossible situation. He just overwhelmed me physically and psychologically. I felt weak and impotent and had no sense of power. So when I come into therapy, I make it a power struggle with you, a battle of wills. That's my therapy. You become like father or mother again, and I battle you like I battled her or him. Only you I'm going to defeat. I'm going to have a battle of wills with you. Under my humiliation at having to surrender to my father or my mother, and I will be incredibly willful. Therefore, if I have an appointment at 4 o'clock, I'll be there probably 4:20. And if I have an appointment for next week, I might cancel it. and call you back on my terms. I'm not going to submit to your terms. I'm not an extension of you, as I was as a child, as an extension of my father, because when he said, shit, I shit, that was it. Scared. Terribly scared. Or mother, not just that you'll beat me, but that you'll abandon me. And father never cared about me anyway, and mother abandons me. How am I going to survive in the world? 4 years old, I can't go out and get a job. How am I going to survive? I'm be able to do it. So if we're going to understand anxiety and psychological pain, which when rejected, disowned, becomes a state of self-disunification, self-division, self-conflict, a splitting within the unitary wholeness of my awareness and my being, then you're going to have to understand this ego, this sense of self which is threatenable. Because when I'm beyond it in psychological adulthood, you can say anything you wish to me, and there's no threat. You can insinuate my worthlessness, my inadequacy, my stupidity, my ugliness, and I'll say, so what? I mean, it doesn't change me. It may be a fact. It still doesn't change what I really am. No words will change what I really am. That we have to come into psychological maturity in order to understand what's being experienced there. And if we have time, I'll be glad to discuss that with you in our sessions. So we must begin with what is the foundation of this psychological sense of self? How is my ego born in the first place, psychologically speaking? Because remember, as long as I am an extension of my mother, I'm not psychologically separated from her. Physically, I can walk around and leave her. Psychologically, I can't, and therefore physically I don't. I stay around the house, I'm afraid even to go outside. I panic. And if you have a phobic reaction, where they can't leave the premises, and if you're going to really undo this phobic reaction, you're going to have to understand something very deeply. So, in not understanding the situation, in some cases, I present to the client, to the therapist, that I'm phobic about my car. I can't get into the car and drive it. And you try to condition me to get into the car in some way, do something or other to get the car to become less feared as an object to me. But as you explore it deeper, you may find that the car is not the thing I'm afraid of. The car is only the means by which I can separate from home. And being separated from home and separated from security and then feeling insecure and then feeling the threat of negation and non-existence as a threat of death, which if you've experienced, you know what it feels like. I mean, your head says, I shouldn't be all this scared. You say, like when you have to take comps exam, or when you have to be evaluated in some way, or when you are not sure of yourself and you have to ask a girl for a date, or perform sexually for the first time and you have doubts about yourself, or whatever the anxiety is, you'll go for a job and be interviewed at a job that's very, very important to you. That as long as I'm not willing to separate from home, you're doing whatever therapy you do with me to get me into the car will usually intensify my panic. Because what I'll do is I'll take a drive with you just to play along with you, and I might make it 4 blocks from home, 6 blocks from home, 8 blocks from home. At a certain point where the red light is, that's as far as I go and I go back. I know I'm going to go back eventually, because at that point, psychologically, I start to feel separated from home equals security, equals aliveness, equals survival. This womb, this home, this mother that is home there waiting for me, this wife of mine, whoever it may be, she is my survival. I cannot become autonomous. If I do, I will not survive. That is not a reality. It is a psychological conviction that we're going to have to deal with. Otherwise, we get compliance only up to a certain point. The minute you have worked with clients in this way, realize you get compliance to a certain point, and then you don't get it beyond that point. And then they revert back. And then you say, but the therapy was going so great. What went wrong? You see. Their commitment from the very beginning was only to go to a certain point. At a point of psychological separatedness, that's when they go back. 2 blocks, 4 blocks, 6 blocks, whatever it may be, still does not trigger that sense of I can't get back when I want to, that sense of control that says if I need to get back quickly, I can. You'll see how security and a sense of control over one's continued survival is really the same phenomenon. There's no such thing as security. It's a psychological sense or sensation based upon your conviction that you have a sense of control over your continued survival. And sometimes your being connected to somebody is your control. Somebody seeing you worthy is your control. So, in the few minutes we have left, let me see if I can at least get into the basic aspects of the ego. So we're asking then, how do we cut the psychological umbilical cord? How are we born psychologically? I've lectured about this before, some of you. Anybody to whom I've not lectured about it have any idea? I need to be born in psychological space. Physically, in space, I'm separated from you. How do I get separated from my mother psychologically so that she's a psychological being within the body and I'm a psychological being? How do I begin to feel separated from her?
In psychotherapy, are you asking?
No, from the very beginning. Psychotherapy will revive the whole situation. How do I feel psychologically separated? From the very beginning, from my mother. What do I have to do to feel separated so I can become a beginning psychological entity in my own right?
You could begin to disobey her.
Yes, that's right. It begins really with the potency of willfulness. No, I won't. Because it is only when my mother asserts her will and I oppose it with my own do I have my first feeling of individuality, separatedness as a psychological being. As long as I'm saying, yes, mother, I'm an extension of her will. And I remain an extension of her psyche, of her psychological sense of self. It's when I say no and get away with it. In some cases I say no and don't get away with it because she overwhelms me, she controls me. So the no doesn't mean anything. It has to be a potent no. I have to say, no, I won't, and get away with it. You're going to make on the potty chair, to hell I will. I'll make in my pants, I'll make on the floor, but I will not comply with your will. Many patients are saying the same thing when they come into therapy. I will not produce here for you. I will produce one by myself, and I'll produce for somebody else, but I will not produce for you. And you begin to feel what's happening psychologically in their interaction with you, and the relationship that's taking place, and what they're living out as psychological need. So the psychological sense of individuation, of being individuated from my mother psychologically, in finite psychological space. I've got to localize myself psychologically. To be a psychological entity, I must be localized in finite psychological space. Just like my body is localized in finite physical space. Here, there's boundaries. I need psychological boundaries too. The potency of my willfulness, my disobedience, my obstinacy, my resistiveness. So the ego is born out of combat. The ego is born out of friction. It's important to understand that because the weaker my ego, the more I live for friction. I've got to keep affirming the sense of psychological separatedness that's not really substantial for me. Because mother or father overwhelmed me, so I don't really feel substantially separated. So I'm intensely belligerent, devil's advocate, hostile, rebellious. I'm one perpetual no. I won't. Whatever it may be that you suggest to me. No, doc, it's not that way at all. You're not really seeing me correctly. No, that's not quite right. No matter what you say, you know you hear it right, they will still say, no, that's not what it is at all. And you feel very frustrated, which is, and impotent, which is what they want. That's their therapy, they think. So the ego is born out of combat. It is born out of conflict. It is born out of willfulness. It is born out of resistiveness, out of friction. And the weaker the ego sense, the weaker my sense of self, the more tenuous, the more fragile, the more shrunken is that sense of self, the more I have to depend upon this combat. Because by combat I feel separate from you. Love and relationship and unification threatens the living daylights out of me because it negates my conviction that I'm psychologically separated. If union is possible, then my psychological separatedness is not absolute. So the adolescent especially is always talking about, don't invade my psychological space. You're getting too close. Give me my space. I've got to have my freedom. Psychologically, I've got to feel separate from you. So that even in sexual relationship, even though the bodies are connected, psychologically they're in fantasy off who knows where. They will not contact you psychologically. And they can't function sexually even without that fantasizing. Because if they don't do that, they feel a kind of psychological connectedness to you, then it nullifies the psychological separateness of individuation that the ego's psychological sense of self depends upon. You've got to feel psychologically individuated from others, not connected to others. So adolescents can't relate. They can't enter into a love relationship because they can't make psychological connection. We can discuss that too, if that interests you in more depth. But I want to at least cover the next step. If we are both children in the same family, both individuating from our mothers, we still have to ask how we're different from each other. We are different from mother, yes, different from father. But how are we different from each other? So this requires a sense of psychological differentiation to clothe the naked sense of psychological individuation, which means self-concept identification, positive and negative, conscious and subconscious. All these concepts help me to feel different from others, differentiated from others, psychologically speaking, which gives me a sense of continuity over psychological time. You see, I'm not an entity, like physically. I have to exist in space and I have to exist in time. There's a time when I was born. There's psychological time as past, present, and future. Psychologically, it must be the same. There must be a time when I was born psychologically, and that sense of self must have continuity over time. So how I saw myself before is how I see myself now, is how I will see myself in the future. And therefore I pretend that because there is continuity over time, that that's the real me. I'm creative then, I'm creative now, I'll be creative in the future, I'm intelligent then, I'm intelligent now. I'm my own definition of male then, I'm my own definition of male now, and I'm adequate then, adequate now, whatever the concepts are. The ego has to feel a sense of localization in space and time, psychological space and time, in order to be an entity. So, the ego is fundamentally based upon a sensation of individuation that comes through a sense of potency of willfulness, oppositionalness, separatedness. And it's based upon sensations of self-concept and self-image affirmation. So that if you see me in the way I see myself, I feel that I am this sense of differentiation. And so quickly, I want to just enumerate, and then we can pick it up next time. That out of the sense of individuation, differentiation, I don't have time to explain all of that, how it happens now, but out of the sense of psychological individuation and differentiation arises the ego's basic needs for a sense of security, worth, or esteem, value, power, or potency of will. Sense of recognition, if I get ignored, I don't get attention, I feel like I don't exist. A sense of animation, which is the ego sense of psychological life, a sense of arousal, a sense of inner substance. I have to feel something arising in me as arousal state of it, so I feel alive and inwardly substantial. And self-concept identity basically founded on the male versus female identity, in other words. That my identity will grow, but on the foundation of male first. Then I'm a particular kind of male, strong, weak, intelligent, creative, the first male. Now, what you have to be able to see, and how you'll be able to be effective in therapy very quickly, is that anxiety or threat, because the ego is identified with all these elements that compose its sense of self, the disaffirmation of these needs becomes its threat of negation, which we call negative feelings. Negative feelings are not feelings in themselves. They represent the negation of the positive things I should be feeling. A feeling of weakness and helplessness or powerlessness is a negative feeling, because it represents the negation of a sense of power or potency of will that I'm supposed to feel if I'm to feel like an ego. Once you understand that threat will be to one of these basic ego needs and pain will be to one of these basic ego needs, the threat will be of the negation of my sense of worth, security, power, so forth and so on. And the pain will come from the actualization of that potential threat. I actually do feel negated in my sense of power. So if I have to put my will on the line, I will feel threat. If I put my will on the line and it proves to be impotent and not potent, then I will feel some form of psychological pain. I may cover it over with its opposite. I may feel depressed, the helplessness aspect of depression. I may cover it over with power, such as anger, rage, hostility, so that I deny my feelings of impotence. And I may even repress those and end up with depression. I may even repress my depression and end up with an urge for alcoholism or compulsive sexuality, or whatever will give me a high to help me escape even from the depression, which is too painful. All right, so the moment that I disown this feeling of pain in the form of a feeling of worthlessness, insecurity, powerlessness, being ignored, lack of attention, I'm not affirmed in my recognition of myself, feeling of deadness, boredom, whatever means disaffirmation of a sense of aliveness, disaffirmed as a male, some aspect of my self-concept identity. When I feel disaffirmed in those needs, I'm going to feel pain, some kind of psychological symptom, pain. And if you understand this, you can explore the pain to the particular need that is being frustrated, and therefore to the particular feeling of deficiency or negation that I'm feeling. Sometimes somebody make a note, remind me how, if the feeling is not available, say if the feeling of worthlessness is not available to conscious awareness, how we can use one's behavior and one's thoughts to trace back to the compensatory need. So for example, if I quickly end with that if my behavior and my thoughts all reflect the fact that I have a need for a sense of worth, and I ask you what happens when you don't do these things to get a sense of worth, then the feelings of worthlessness will arise. And psychotherapy is not gratifying your need for worth, but helping you outgrow your child's sense of worthlessness, with which you're identified, these feelings of negation that keep you fixated and immature. So you might remind me to talk about that more next time. Any just quick questions at this point? Yes, we are leaving. Okay. Sure. Okay. So, do you want me to put away an hour, or you want something for 2 hours?
I don't think that there is another one on the whole of the campus at this time. So
Okay, we'll just proceed as an hour.
L17, and it goes back.
Well, one subject at a time, because it never goes through more than one subject at a time. We're talking about manipulating data for each subject before you ever get to running over subjects.
Okay.
See, this is all data manipulation. We're not talking about running programs or anything like that, okay? Which is a critical part.
So it's within a subject?
Everything we're doing here in the beginning is within a subject. Okay? All the computes. And it does the same thing for every subject, of course. But,
Right.
yeah, it never adds over subjects. None of these things that I'm going to do add over subjects. Okay?
Okay.
Now, so LA, if this is, the end of this loop is going to say end repeat. Okay?
Okay.
Now, let me just, going to show you a simple thing. I'm simply going to count. And the answer is going to be 4. It'll always be 4. No matter who the subject is. It's not making any decisions. It's just doing it. Okay? Now, this is called initializing a variable. what it means is that you're going to clear out the bin in the computer. I guess that's the best way to put it. And one of the things you have to understand about the computer is that it's loaded up with garbage. Always.
So you always have to put a 0 to start.
Well, no. You don't always have to. Depends what you're doing. But the computer is loaded. I mean, when you go to use the computer for any purpose, it goes and gets a bunch of locations. Those locations are charged. They have numbers in them for our purposes. Okay? And they aren't empty. They aren't empty. They have whatever. The last number was 10,772,000. That's what's still in there. Now, if you go to that location, the minute you name something, right, it goes to a location in the computer. I mean, it's not called NL, except in your mind. It's location 72315, right? Just to make up a number. And location 71325 has garbage in it. Okay. Now, the minute you say that location, well, I'm just saying this is the same as location 71325, is equal to something, right? It exchanges what is in there for this. So if you say it's equal to 0, it empties out what's ever in there and puts a 0 in. Okay? If I said it's equal to 32, a 32 would be in there instead of what's in there. Okay? So the minute you say something is equal, you're fine. Now what happens when you add? When you add, you're not exchanging something, you're adding something on. And if it's not 0 in the first place, see, let's say I never had this statement. The minute I say compute NL, it goes to a location, 17,332, right? And it says that whatever's in that location, right, that's what NL is equal to whatever in that location plus 1. So if the number that's already in there is 52.5, NL is now equal to 53.5, right? Not 1, but 53.5. But if you now make NL 0, NL is equal to 0 the first time, is equal to 0 plus 1, which is 1. Right? So whenever you're adding anything on to something, not just setting something equal to something else, you have to initialize the 0 out. That's why I did that. Now, the way the do-repeat facility works is that it steps through here. Okay? Starts off, right? And it says LA is equal to these things, in order, one at a time. This thing, there is going to be as many steps through the loop as there are things named here. There are going to be 4 steps through the loop. Okay? That is automatically determined by the number of things named. The first step, LA is going to be equal to L17. Okay? So now it's going to say compute, in the first step, NL is equal to NL plus 1. NL was 0 before we entered this. So 0 is equal to 0 plus 1. End repeat, which means go on to the second step. Okay? Now, it's not doing anything with these in the way I've said this. I've been just going through them. It's just going through 4 times. So the second time through the loop, NL will be equal to 1. 1 is equal to 1 plus 1 is 2. When it finishes 4 of these, NL will be equal to 4. Okay? I've just counted. That's all I've done here. Okay? Now, let's say that I compute LO is equal to 0, and now I compute LO is equal to LO plus LA. It's adding them up. Because the first time LA is equal to that, so LO will be equal to L17, and the second time LO will be equal to L17 is equal to L17 plus LA now becomes that, L32. Right? So it keeps pulling them out and adding them on. Okay. So here it's adding up the love scores, here it's counting. Now, this counting doesn't do me any good.